Hello, everyone. My name is Rick Hidalgo. I am the chair of the WEAT Safety and Security Committee, and will be hosting today's webinar. Today's webinar will be on security best practices for unmanned facilities, and we have four great speakers that are lined up today. We're going to start off with some presentations, and then we're going to follow that with a panel discussion between the multiple speakers that are on the call today. Let me introduce to the speakers that we have today. Sean McMillan will be starting us off. He's going to be talking about recent events related to security of unmanned facilities. Sean is the electrical division department manager of Jones & Carter's water practice. His experience includes the electrical and instrumentation design of multiple wastewater treatment plants, lift stations, water plants, and utility projects. His work includes instrumentation design, electrical one-line development, process narrative writing, and SCADA development of PLC programming, HMI development, and reporting. Sean is a member of WEAT, as well as the Water Environment Federation and of the International Society of Automation. Following Sean will be John Paul Dixon with Hatch Schrader. John Paul is going to talk about the regulatory requirements that are in place by TCEQ and DHS and other agencies that should be considered for these types of facilities. John Paul is an associate with Hatch Schrader. He's been with the firm for 10 years, starting as a design engineer and working his way up to the current role of project manager. His experience includes design and implementation of power distribution systems, instrumentation and controls, SCADA, and communications infrastructure. He has a BS in electrical engineering from Prairie View A&M University, and like Sean, is a member of WEAT and ISA, and also the National Society of Black Engineers. Mike Mason with Coastal Water Authority will be providing the presentation on some of the things that they've run into and some lessons learned. And Greg Olinger, who is not on the call yet, but hopefully will be joining us later. He had another commitment that he was tied into. Will be supporting Mike on his presentation. Mike is the Security, Safety, and Emergency Manager of the Coastal Water Authority. He earned 4 undergraduate degrees in Security and Law Enforcement and a Master's of Science degree in Security Administration from the Central Michigan University. He's earned several professional certifications, including Certified Protection Professional and Certified Emergency Manager. He has served several years as board members of InfraGuard in Houston. Other leadership positions he has held are past chairman of the Houston chapter, chairman of the Oil, Gas, and Chemical Security Council, and vice president for Region 6, all of which are divisions of the International Security Management Organization known as ASIS International. He's retired from the U.S. Navy, and his last duty assignment was Chief of Police and Emergency Manager for the Navy's largest base, which was in Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico. Greg, again, will be joining us later. Greg is the Chief Engineer and Operations Manager of Coastal Water Authority. He earned his BS in Civil Engineering from the U.S. Military Academy, and he holds an MBA from the University of Houston and a Master's in Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. Greg oversees the development, design, and construction of new projects and the operations and maintenance of a 1 billion gallon per day raw water pump, conveyance, and distribution system. He manages a staff of 75 personnel responsible for the operations and maintenance of CWA's water resource infrastructure. And he serves as a board member for the Society of American Military Engineers Houston Post. And he also serves our country as colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves. Before I turn it over to Sean, I'd like to thank Greg and Mike for their service to our country. Sean, I'll let you take over from here.
Great, thanks, Rick. I'll wait just a moment. Here we go. All right, so I'm going to start off today's conversation. We got some good presentations after me with John Paul talking about kind of regulations and requirements, and then Mike and Greg talking about an actual case study of some things that they've done. So I was going to start off today with some of the recent events, things that are out there in the news related to security and unmanned facilities, and then just kind of run down a handful of the common issues that I've been seeing kind of lately as I go out to the field, just as a good reminder of things that we should be or shouldn't be doing. So anyhow, the topics I'm going to cover under the recent events, we'll talk a little bit about Hurricane Harvey, and then the threat in the news of North Korea. So first of all, Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey, as you all know, kind of hit here in the Houston area at the end of August. When it hit at Rockport and Corpus Christi, it hit as kind of what we would call a traditional hurricane with high winds, high rain, moved on through. But what we got here in Houston was not what you would consider a traditional hurricane. So in 2008, when Hurricane Ike came through, Hurricane Ike hit the Houston area. And after that hurricane, we did a lot of work on, what type of a storm should we be prepared for? What does a hurricane look like here in Houston, and what should we be prepared for? So some of the things that we all did design-wise after Hurricane Ike, there were a lot of programs to get backup generators at facilities because we had a lot of power outages and some real long extended power outages in some cases. And then making sure that anything we designed was suitable for high wind loads. So that included, SCADA radio antenna towers, things like that, anything that was going to be up in the air, making sure that we were ready for those high winds that come as part of a traditional hurricane. So what did we actually get? We didn't actually get those winds. We didn't actually get a storm that just kind of blew through. What we got is a storm that came and set on us. And dropped, I think the last prediction, or the last numbers that I saw, they estimated about 50 inches of water on the entire Houston area. So, I guess it's always kind of funny because they always say, what are we doing? What do we always do? We're always preparing for the last storm that we had. So whenever something happens, we always look back at that event and try to figure out, well, how can we be ready for this next time? Obviously, the problem here was what we got the next time wasn't what we got last time. So some of the unique challenges that operators for remote facilities faced during Hurricane Harvey, power. Power is an interesting one because we were all prepared for a loss of power. What we weren't quite prepared for is to have power during this kind of a flooding event. So we had a lot of sites that had power and still had water on the ground. After the storm, as a lot of people here in the Houston area did, I went around and helped muck some houses for people. And it was kind of interesting to me how many houses had 6 or 8 inches of water and never lost power during the entire storm. So that caused some issues, I think, because the next point here is access. There were some sites that operators were unable to get access to, and yet because we never lost power, the plant continued to run, but we didn't really know what was going on there because we couldn't physically access due to the inundation of the water. A lot of sites we had rising water, not flowing water. So rather than things getting washed away, it just sort of came up and topped things. So that water elevation as it came up caused all sorts of issues for us that I think people were not necessarily prepared for. So what are the lessons learned? And I guess I would first caution by saying I wouldn't rush out and make any changes to what you're doing right now based on Hurricane Harvey. Like I said, we always tend to want to prepare for the last storm we had. Hurricane Harvey, history might show was a unique event, or it might show that this is something that's going to happen more and more often. But what do we prepare for next time? So in preparation for next time, I would say the things, if I were an operator and I were running the plant, the first thing I would think about is remote access. We always talk about SCADA and being able to access our SCADA remotely as being an advantage to an operator because it limits the windshield time. It allows them to see what's going on at their sites in the field without having to drive out there. But a lot of times that's seen as a nicety. It's something that's nice to have, but not absolutely required. But in a situation where you physically can't get from one site to another site, or you can't access a site, it becomes even more important to be able to see remotely what's going on at your site. So that may be something that to consider is, if you don't have a SCADA system with remote access, looking into adding that so that you can see that plant even when you're not there. The next thing, remote visibility. I deal with a lot of mud districts that that have security cameras in place. And everybody kind of thinks about security cameras as being, you know, we're looking for intruders, we're trying to monitor our site, so everything tends to be outward facing. And I think one of the lessons that would have been nice in a lot of cases is to maybe have one or two cameras that were inward facing, where we could see what's going on the plant grounds during this event. Because I think in a lot of cases, we didn't, you know, we might have known what was happening around, but we didn't know what was happening inside the walls. The next thing I have on here, I think in general, it's a good idea to keep your electrical, you know, up high. You know, there's a lot of places where I see junction boxes, terminal boxes, things like that that are very low. You know, obviously we're required by TCEQ to keep things out of the 100-year floodplain. But what do you do in a 500-year flood or an 800-year flood or whatever they're now calling Hurricane Harvey? So there may not be anything you can do, but in general, the fewer electrical components you have down low, the better off you're going to be. And then again, you know, I think it's important for a lot of operators to know your elevations. You know, as design engineers, we always mark that 100-year floodplain, but what does a 500-year floodplain look like? What does the 1,000-year floodplain look like? You know, what is my lowest basin wall height? So when water starts to come up and I see, you know, the elevation in Spring Creek or Cypress Creek is whatever level, kind of having some idea of what does that mean for your basins? What does that look like at your plant when the water comes up to that elevation? That may mean you have 2 or 3 panels under. That may mean you're topping a basin, you know, that kind of thing. So just knowing and kind of having a mental image of what that might look like for your plant. There's a really great video out there. I would encourage everybody to go look at, and the easiest way to get to it is if you search for CBS News, Houston water plant flooding. There's a video about the City of Houston Northeast Water Purification Plant. And an interview with Drew Molly, who's in charge of the plant out there, about some of the things that they had to do as the water started to rise to put up some temporary barricades and pump some of the water out in order to keep some of their basins from being topped. So anyhow, really interesting thing to see. Something that they did a really good job of on the fly, but it may be something that is worth you kind of having that in your mind ahead of time of what would I do if this happened and how would I handle that? Again, not necessarily saying it's time to rush out and spend money on it today, but just being prepared, because again, you know, there's always the chance that it could happen again. The next topic I'm going to talk about in the current events. You know, we hear a lot about cybersecurity. We talk a lot about cybersecurity. And I think in a lot of cases, there is this general idea that cybersecurity is some hooded guy in Russia or China that's generally kind of just out there looking to cause havoc and make trouble. There have been some reports recently that there's been some, they believe, some specific spear phishing campaigns in the electric utility industry from the North Koreans, where they're actually looking to map what's out there and you know, what devices are on control networks and how to get to them. So what does this mean? This is more of this isn't a general shady cybersecurity risk. This is someone that we could potentially be going to war with, who is out there intentionally looking at our infrastructure and trying to figure out what they can do to undermine that infrastructure. So what do you need to do? I would say in general, I mean, I wouldn't be concerned about this in particular, but you need to understand kind of what these things are. So, you know, spear phishing, basically, they're out there, they're sending emails to people, they're hoping you're going to open attachments. You know, there's things going on. So don't open any attachments in your email that you don't recognize. Don't respond to things. If you get a phone call, you know, like a lot of us do, the call from Microsoft technical support telling you have a virus, don't get suckered into that kind of thing. Don't do what they tell you to do. Be aware of anything that's out of the ordinary. If your SCADA computers suddenly start to lag and they haven't been before, if you notice odd pop-ups, programs that are open that might not have been open the last time. It's a good idea to go ahead, say something, have somebody come out and look at it, run a good virus scan on it, and make sure everything is clean. And again, use good cybersecurity technique or hygiene. Use good cybersecurity hygiene. So what I'm talking about here is, as at a remote site, you may not have external connections to other systems, and so you think, oh, I'm good. But there, I know a lot of sites where people will carry thumb drives out there to download data off of it, and memory cards and that kind of thing. Make sure you're running scans on those. Make sure those are safe. Don't assume that just because you have an air gap that there's nothing that can get into your system, because you may be carrying it around with you. So I'm sorry, I'm reading through cybersecurity here, common issues that I see now out there in the field. Cybersecurity, October Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and there's some really interesting things out there. They've done a kind of a good job with this campaign. So I would encourage you to go out and kind of do a search for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. There's been some very interesting articles about good cybersecurity hygiene. What do you need to be aware of? What kind of risks are out there? And so I would definitely encourage any operator that uses a computer as part of their control system to just kind of go out there and read up, because there's some really good stuff out there. One of the things that I've seen a lot of lately is people put in security systems. They put in camera systems. They put in SCADA. They need a connection to the outside world. They'll call AT&T, get UVerse installed, and the device will be installed, and boom, they're working. And they may even put a firewall on it, whatever, but they don't ever shut down their Wi-Fi. So it's just on with the factory default Wi-Fi. I would absolutely encourage, if you're not using it, turn it off. You'd be surprised how many plants have just open Wi-Fi hotspots out in the plant that don't need to be there. So any connections you're not using, any Wi-Fi hotspots you're not using, be sure to turn those off. And then again, as I talked earlier with cybersecurity, just be vigilant, be aware, and don't dismiss when things don't seem quite right. A lot of times your intuition is correct. So at that point, it's a good idea to go ahead, run an antivirus scan. If you have continuing questions about, again, things lagging, things not acting quite right, get somebody out to look at it. The last item I have to discuss today under my common issues is under physical security. I know a lot of sites that have padlocks out there, and the operators do a really good job of padlocking the gate, padlocking the control building, padlocking all the control panels. I mean, they may even padlock junction boxes, anything that has, major conductors through them, but then they all have the same combination code. And it's the same combination code that kind of is everywhere. There are a large number of sites that if you know one combination code, not only can you get into the site, you can get into any of the items on that site. And those codes get passed to maintenance companies, engineering companies, etc. And pretty soon you don't have the physical security you thought you did, because now you have a lot of people who know your passcode. So I would strongly encourage, if you use padlocks, that you think about instituting a program for changing the combination regularly on those padlocks and making sure that only people who absolutely need those codes get in. And if you have to give it out to someone at some point, like one of us poor engineers who's trying to get in and do an investigation of your site, it's a good idea to change it after you give it out. So anyhow, I think that's about all that I had for today. We're going to go ahead and answer all the questions during the question and answer period. So if you put in any questions under the chat box, I'm not ignoring, but at this point, I am going to go ahead and hand off to John Paul, who will be our next presenter.
Hello, John Paul here. Let me get situated. Sorry about that. All right, and I will ask here, can everybody see everything okay? Oops. All right, well, I am going to talk about federal and state physical security requirements for water facilities. Again, my name is John Paul Dixon. I'm with Hatch Schrader. Been so for about 10 years now. I'm going to start off talking about some of the agencies that monitor and regulate, some of the requirements as it relates to security for water in particular. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Homeland Security, both at the federal level, issue mandates, regulations, acts and laws even that all pertain to securing water facilities. At the state level, mainly we're looking at TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. I think most people probably on the line here are very familiar with TCEQ. So they do have security requirements listed in some of their bylaws. And then, of course, other is being just the local municipality having jurisdiction. So your local city will also create their own requirements for any particular site. A lot of things when it comes to laws and jurisdictions, the requirements get stricter as you go down the list. So your cities and municipalities are going to have tighter requirements than the state or than the federal level, but it's still a good idea to at least know what people from the higher up levels are looking at and are requiring as it relates to security. Just a little background on the EPA. Their mission is to protect the human health and the environment. They accomplish this by developing and enforcing regulations. When Congress writes an environmental law, we implement it by writing regulations, often set the national standards for states. And so all of these regulations are then followed by the state, the various organizations and whatnot, to better protect and secure our environment. And of course, water infrastructure, critical infrastructure is part of our environment, so we obviously want to make sure that it is safe. A couple of federal acts that have been passed in the recent years that all kind of have some type of dealing with keeping water safe: the U.S. Patriot Act, Bioterrorism Act, Homeland Security Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Clean Water Act. A lot of these acts were actually initiated after 9/11, when people started looking at terrorism in a lot bigger light. One of the interesting things is that, so a lot of these acts actually have a lot more recommendations as opposed to strict requirements per se. So one of the things of note is that in the Drinking Water Act, vulnerability assessments are a requirement of utility systems above 3,000 people or 3,000 connections. These assessments are to be conducted and carried out on a routine basis, and these assessments help each water utility assess the vulnerabilities in their system. So for remote water facilities, it's a good idea to run this assessment and evaluate the risk associated with the facility being out unmanned. And most remote facilities are probably checked in once a day. Well, then you have 23 hours after that for anything to happen. And if you're not actively evaluating those risks, that can leave you in a bad spot. A few other organizations that kind of help out with safety and security, the AWWA, ASCE, WEF, WRF, and then of course WEAT. All of these organizations have special interest groups and other things that kind of partner with the local utility to help increase the security measures around. Other additional security partners, your local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, knowing their number and having people to contact whenever something does happen is going to be critical for any utility. Your neighboring utility, so if you have a remote facility, it may be right next door to the facility or to a neighboring utility that could help out with the security aspects of it. And then also community residents. A lot of unmanned facilities may actually be next to a resident constituent in a neighborhood or a subdivision. Actually getting to know those people and foster a relationship with them, they can be the eyes and ears on the ground that you need to give you additional insight to what's happening at an unmanned facility. Some of these security standards that have been published recently, the AWWA's G430-14, Security Practices in Operations and Management, and also the J100-10, Risk and Management for Water and Wastewater Systems. So what these are best practices, recommendations, and guidelines specifically tailored to the water and wastewater industry. And by following a lot of these standards and recommendations, it can help increase the resiliency of any water utility when they're adhered to. So just a snippet from one of them, the purpose of this standard was to define the minimum requirements for a protective security program for a water or wastewater utility that will promote the protection of employee safety, public health, public safety, and public confidence. And in general, this standard was built upon what most utilities have already done in having a multi-barrier approach to protection of their facilities. Addition, these are just some of the highlights as well, just to protect the public, reduce risk in the water sector. So there's a lot of good information in these standards and guidelines that have been put together that, when followed, will definitely increase the resiliency of infrastructure as a whole. Again, some of the highlights of this standard are the commitment to security, a security culture, defined security roles and employees' expectations. And I kind of want to back up and talk about the security culture for a moment and piggyback on top of what Sean was alluding to. Having a security culture is getting everybody involved in the organization thinking about security, whether it's physical security, cybersecurity, in some shape or fashion. You can have the most secure facility in the world, but if one of your employees is not security minded, they can literally give the keys away to the threat or the attacker, and all of the security goes out the window at that point. So it is very critical to routinely have people go through these training seminars such that they can start thinking in a security mindset to help increase the overall security of facilities. The other standard, the J100-10, this was actually built a later version of the previous one and was built on top of it. So the first edition of this was published on July 1st, 2010, and it was a joint effort between the American Society of Military Engineers, ANSI, and AWWA. This again, so the first standard was really geared more towards terrorism and vandalism, acts of those kinds. What it didn't include were environmental disasters. The J100 includes the environmental aspects of securing your facility and making sure that there is business continuity if in the event of any catastrophic event. To touch on what the TCEQ requires, if you're looking at Chapter 290 of the TCEQ and Chapter D, Rules and Regulations for Public Water, Drinking Water, You note that the TCEQ actually leans on what the EPA mandates, and where all utilities must comply with the EPA with risk management plans. The only other security mention in TCEQ Chapter 290 is that all treatment facilities must be enclosed by an intruder-resistant fence. And I'll explain about intruder-resistant fences a little more in detail a little bit later. But now we will move on to, well, what happens whenever you do have an event? Well, the TCEQ mandates that you must contact the executive director after the following events take place. So an unusual or unexplained entry at a property in a water system, an act of terrorism against the water system, an unauthorized attempt to probe or gain for access to proprietary information, theft of property that supports key activities in the system, a natural disaster or accident that results in damage to the public water system. So any of these events were to occur, that utility is responsible for reporting that to the TCEQ and letting them know some of the details of what that incurred. Moving on to Chapter 17, or 217, sorry, that's a typo, but Chapter 217 in the TCEQ, they have a little more detailed section as it relates to remote sites, i.e. lift stations in a wastewater collection systems. First, all sites must be restricted by access by any unauthorized person. They piggyback on 290 and mention that you have to have an intruder-resistant fence around the site and lock everything up. So each access point must be locked. That lock can be a combo lock, a key lock, a key card, biometrics if you go that far. The intruder-resistant fence must be at least 6 feet tall with barbed wire, and the bottom of the fence must be close enough to the ground to where people can't get up under it. And in order to elude the barbed wire requirements, you can actually raise the fence up to 8 feet tall, and that will allow you to not have to have the barbed wire requirement on the fence. Additionally, if there's any above ground valves located outside of the fence area, the valve must be chained to prevent unauthorized operation of the valve. If the valve is located below ground, then of course the vault cover, that needs to be locked in order to prevent unauthorized access and just preventing anybody from off the street from coming up and accessing the valve and operating it. So a little more on some of the intruder-resistant fence types. The height of a fence can be considered intruder-resistant. So as the TCEQ mentioned, adding height to it will deter people from trying to climb the fence and get into the site and access stuff. Eliminating the top rail, what that does is just make it that much more harder for the intruder to actually climb the fence. Of course, barbed wire, you can actually bury the bottom of the fence in the ground. That way you can prevent anybody from tunneling underneath and getting access to this remote facility. One thing that I found unique, and I've actually seen some people do it, is color the fence. So your typical chain link fence obviously is silver, and so it's hard to tell if you don't inspect it thoroughly each day whether or not somebody has done something to the fence, if there's damage to the fence. If you can color the fence, then that can draw more attention to whenever the fence has been modified or damaged, such that when the person checks the facility in for the day, they can bring attention to it and go ahead and get it fixed. A double row of fencing, so you essentially have two fences that would, again, deter any kind of intruders, because now not only do they have to get through one fence, but they have to get through two. A clear zone, which is deployed in a lot of situations. And the clear zone is nothing more than just a clear area of grass. So a lot of remote facilities can be deployed in a heavily wooded area. Well, if you have a whole lot of brush and trees and whatnot growing up against the fence, again, it kind of makes it hard to assess the integrity of the fence if you have that greenery right up next to the fence. So having a clear zone of about 4 to 6 feet allows you to keep that maintained and properly watch it, such that if anything happens to the fence, you can easily recognize it. And then of course additional lighting. At nighttime, obviously it's going to be hard to see without light, so you want to make sure that you have additional lighting, security lighting even, to where they are activated by motion sensors to provide additional light in the night whenever something happens. That is always a big deterrent for any kind of theft. Nobody wants to be seen committing a crime, so if you can shine the light on them, all the better. Some of the other considerations, so chemical systems and cybersecurity and network security, from a chemical systems aspect, some of the remote facilities have chemicals on site. Something like chlorine gas obviously is toxic. If your remote facility is not properly secured, somebody could access it and cause great harm to the public by, tampering with the chemical feed systems in the facility. So you want to include that in your risk analysis to let you know how big of a risk it is. Cyber and network security, even though the facility is unmanned, a lot of times you do have a remote SCADA system to where the facility is monitored remotely through the SCADA system. Well, if you have an intruder access that, and it doesn't even have to be an intruder, it could be a contractor, a service guy that is coming in to do work on the facility. Well, through the network connection and through the SCADA system on the local level at that remote facility, if your cybersecurity isn't up to par, that person can now have access to your main facility, and further, just depending on how the network is actually intertwined. So with physical security of the remote facilities, you also want to make sure that cybersecurity is best practices are followed. So any of the network equipment, making sure that that's in a secure locked spot such that a random contractor does not have access to it, and that the only people that have access to any of the network equipment are people that are authorized and have the designated credentials to access that. Some additional training resources as it relates to security, the counterterrorism and security in the water industry, emergency response planning, security hardware. All of these publications have been produced and have very valuable information in setting up how to just go about evaluating your system, putting up proper procedures, and actually implementing them throughout your system. When it comes to security, as mentioned earlier, it's a mindset, it's a culture that you want your whole organization to have. It starts all the way at the top, and the weakest link is the person that doesn't know. So everybody within the organization has to be on board with making sure that security is carried out through all ends. As Sean mentioned, you want to make sure that even administrators and admin have proper security protocols learned, and that they're following that, because somebody can call up and the receptionist answers the phone. If the receptionist gives out the password to one of the remote facilities, that's like handing the keys to the car to the thief. So you want to make sure that everybody is properly aware of proper security protocols. And here are just some of the references that are all throughout this presentation here. And that is all I have to speak about today. So at this point, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Mr. Mike Mason, and he will let you know what Coastal Water Authority is doing on their end.
Okay, I'm Mike Mason, and hopefully everybody can see my screen now. And basically, I'm sorry, thought I had a question. Basically, what I'm doing is talking about how the security practices and procedures that were previously addressed, how you implement them at the where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Basically, what happened is, it was previously alluded to, we had the findings of the security vulnerability assessment that was directed by the Environmental Protection Agency. And there were a list of many things that needed to be addressed. In other words, a lot of gaps were identified in that security vulnerability assessment. And we were considered part of the City of Houston's assessment, since we are basically most of the front end water supply for the city. And so that was very beneficial to us, and we were able to understand exactly what we needed to do and so forth. So this photo that you see here represents a theory in security management design that's called the weakest link. In other words, security around your facility could be represented by a chain, and the weakest link in that chain would be an indicator of how good your security is or not good. And basically what you need is 4 things at each of your facilities, whether they be manned or unmanned, in order to have effective physical and electronic protection systems. And first one is deterrence. And although it's not generally part of the physical protection system, it can reduce the occurrence of crime or low-level vandal attacks. Then you need some sort of detection, which requires security measures such as lighting, CCTV cameras, sensors, for the purpose of detecting the presence of an intruder, what direction they're going, and so forth. Then you want to have delay, which consists primarily of hardening devices, which involves the use of barriers. And then you also want multiple layers, and I'll show that to you in just a moment. Then, of course, with all of these, especially the detection piece of it, there's going to have to be some type of response. And if you do not have a security people on your staff, then you're going to have to rely on either armed patrol, private patrol, or you're going to have to rely on law enforcement. I think we would all agree that law enforcement is pretty well overtaxed, and therefore it's best if you get with your local law enforcement agency and tell them who you are and tell them how important your facility is. Now here is a visual representation of the 4 things that I just got through talking to you about. This exemplifies an attack by an intruder. So the first thing under deterrence, we have signs around our facility every 100 feet in both English and Spanish that there's no trespassing, that violators will be prosecuted, and as we get cameras installed at each of our facilities, we also include signs that indicate that cameras are in use and there will be a police response. That's outside the exterior perimeter. Then we have an interior perimeter and an exterior perimeter at each of our facilities. And basically, if an intruder, as you see there in that clear zone, as John Paul talked about, between an interior and exterior fence, the idea is to have a delay of that individual who is going to go after a critical asset. So this example I have here is about a 3-minute time lag where a person would come over the first barrier, get to what they were after, and then hopefully leave on their part. So the first part, detection, what does not work is I once worked at a facility that had a 6-mile fence, and it took 50 fixed cameras to view the entire fence. And then they had several pan tilt zoom cameras, PTZ cameras. But the problem with that is they have to be operated by an individual. They're typically. So all of this added up together is very expensive when it comes to the fact that you also have to put lighting along the fences so that the your typical CCTV cameras are able to see what's going on. And then you need a security monitor to be available 24/7 to monitor the security cameras and respond or indicate or activate some type of response to an intruder. So all of that's very expensive, and if you're going to do it, you're going to have to put out a lot of money. But what we were looking for are things that did not require so much expenditures. And what we came up with is an advanced security system, which performs a combination of security tasks. This is called an integrated system, which includes perimeter protection. It activates alarms. It enables alarm discrimination. That it means looking at the camera and determining, is it a valid alarm or is it a fake alarm or false alarm? It records the video of all occurrences for follow-up actions. In our case, whenever we have trespassers or copper thieves or whatever, we always like to show a still photo to the responding law enforcement officer who makes the report. And that's so much better than just saying, we have no idea who did it, what direction they came from, or what they look like. Then also it's been valuable to especially corporations avoiding civil litigation because they can demonstrate that they did have adequate security and by using the video. It's also available for identifying the root cause of safety accidents and also personnel accountability during emergencies. One of the most important assets that an organization has is its people. And when they go out to remote unmanned facilities, if anything happens to them, it would be good if you could see if they are in a problem so you can send someone out to help them and exactly where they are. Our security operates automatically and only necessitates human action during alarms. And it's also low maintenance and high performance integrated system. And we have various sites, some manned and some unmanned, and all of the systems that we have in place and will be putting in place in the future report back to our main facility, which is where our server is located. And there's always 3 people here 24/7. This is an example of the type of coverage that we have on our facilities. What you see there in the middle is a red dot, and that indicates a pole where 2 types of cameras that we use. One is a radar, and the other below it is a automatic camera. And so that large red area that you see there is where the radar is constantly looking. It requires no light whatsoever. It works in any kind of rain, snow, fog, and because we do have a lot of fog where we are. And again, we save a tremendous amount of money by having this system and not having to put lighting in all these places to enable the radar to see. And then once the radar determines that there is a possible intruder or someone that's tinkering with the fence or whatever the case may be, there is an automatic camera that's mounted just below the radar that the computer system automatically directs. It's a pan tilt zoomed camera and it uses starlight technology to be able to see in low light, and it zooms over there, and that enables the security officer who's looking at the alarm determine, is it a rabbit, is it a terrorist, or is it a human, what is it exactly? And so that system operates very effectively for us. Access control, as both folks alluded to before, obviously at a remote site, you don't want to have the cost of having a security officer there. Keys and locks are not effective because the keys are shared sometimes with unauthorized people. People come and go in employment, and it's difficult to get those keys back, which, as John Paul stated, you need to change those locks pretty often. And they're pretty expensive when you do that. Now, in places where we do have padlocks, we use a particular type of lock that has masters, submasters, and keys that are issued to individuals working only in that facility, but all of those padlocks are behind our electronic security system. And then the key usage, of course, produces no record when an individual uses that key to open, to go in or leave a facility, and therefore there's no really good way to ensure individual accountability. But what does work as far as access control does is our access control system, which we have at multiple sites and is connected to our main server via some places a T1 line, some places it's a fiber optic cable, some places it's internet. And so as a result, we can issue the ID cards, which are proximity ID cards, rather than bar codes and magnetic stripes, which are very old technology. The proximity ID cards are almost impossible to counterfeit or replicate without going to a lot of expense and money. And basically at our facilities, we read in and we read out so that we can, if we have an emergency at that facility, we can go onto the system and see who is still on site, which, as we talked about before, it's really important if you have a hazmat there that those people are monitored. And then we print the individual's picture on the outside of the ID card with their name, and the card allows access to all the sites where the employees is supposed to go. So with our system, we can turn that card on in the server to a limited number of facilities. And if the individual is terminated and refuses to return the ID card, we can turn the all access all the time off by making a few manipulations in the mainframe of the computer. And so it will also give us an alarm if an individual's ID card is turned off and they're still trying to get in. As I said before, it does create an alarm with regard to the in and out reads if there is a problem. Now this is an example of how our access control works at one of our facilities. It's connected underground by Cat5 cable, and we have controllers at various spots, and it's monitored at multiple locations, including in this particular facility. We do have a guard, not only monitoring this particular facility, but other facilities, and we have a control room, which is always manned. So if the guard leaves, then he tells the operator, and the operator monitors the system in that person's absence while they're making rounds. So what are we trying to protect these unmanned facilities from? Well, you have a myriad of individuals who sometimes get fixated on entering a facility. These include criminals, and criminals include trespassers, vandals, thieves, sometimes active shooters. Then you have the possibility of terrorists whose primary intent is to cause major damage and as many deaths as possible. Of course, in an unmanned facility, it would probably be cause major damage or possibly release a container of hazmat. We have ammonia and chlorine at one of our sites, so we are specifically attuned to protecting those items. And then, as I believe one person mentioned before, trusted insiders. These are employees. Our employees go through a preliminary check before we hire them. The ones that are hired have to go through the transportation worker identification card process. And what this is, and the reason why they have to go through that, is some of our unmanned facilities are located on the Port of Houston property, and they are regulated by the Maritime Transportation Safety Act, which requires anyone who's there unescorted, they have to have a TWIC. And that check of the individual in order to get the TWIC includes not only checking all criminal databases, but also terrorist databases, no-flight lists, and a myriad of other. We also have to have a City of Houston ID card, and that's issued every year. TWIC cards are good for, I believe, 5 years. And the City of Houston ID cards issued every year, and the City of Houston Public Utilities Division is the one that issues that card, and they have the Houston Police Department do background checks as well. But the reason why it's so important to do all these checks of employees and also contractor employees is basically they are the most familiar with the intricacies of every facility. Where can the most damage be caused? What is there that could be pilfered? So they could cause a major problem. In fact, the FBI has identified individuals with some organized crime, like motorcycle gangs, for example, who will get one of their underlings to go to work for a company that's a target and get all sorts of information as an employee. These are the type. This matrix represents the types of adversaries and their threat capabilities, with the lesser adversaries on the left and the saboteurs, which are another name for terrorists, over toward the right. And the most dangerous, of course, is your trusted insider, because they have the keys to the kingdom. And basically, the vandals, they destroy property and graffiti. And we had one that was a homeless guy. He lives in a building that he constructed trespassing off our property, but he was climbing up our power pole and connecting onto the electrical wires with alligator clips connected to wires that powered his shack. And every time he did that, it caused our SCADA system to go offline, and that's when we first discovered what he was doing. Criminals, of course, they'll strip your copper out of your conduit, and looking typically for things that they can steal to cause them financial gain. The saboteurs or terrorists, they're looking to create as much havoc as possible, and typically they'll either bring some type of weapon or explosive with them, or they'll use your hazmat container to do what it is they're going to do. So all of this, in order to have a good security system that works, you need to have effective security administration. And if you do a security vulnerability assessment, this is a whole category in and of itself. The security administration first involves going in and looking at the security risks and documenting them in your security manual, which all of which items that come after that should be addressing the gaps identified in the security vulnerability assessment. We also have ours in our emergency action plan, because in our organization, security and emergency action are parallel. And that's conducted by doing periodic security vulnerability assessments, identifying the gaps and then filling the gaps. And first thing you have to do is develop a security strategy, which is the first thing I did when I came here over 13 years ago. And I presented that security strategy to our executive director and the board to get their approval, so that everything that I did subsequently could always be tied back to that strategy, and the policies and procedures are the application of the strategy. And then also, our budget reflects a commitment to the approved strategies, and so everything that we do with regard to spending money on security needs to support the strategy, policies, and procedures. And we roll those procedures out to all of our employees through training, and then we do annual and periodic training to reinforce what we taught them to begin with. And then we do inspections and to ensure that we have compliance at each one of our facilities in accordance with the security procedures. And we update our security procedures annually. It's not something that just sits on the shelf, just like the emergency operations plan. It needs to be periodically reviewed and updated. And then maintaining vigilance for emerging threats and planning to react accordingly. Now, these are free security intelligence sources that I use on a daily basis to see if there's anything on the radar, so to speak, that either is a general security threat or specific to water or dams or so forth that we are involved with. The first one is the Water ISAC. That is a public-private partnership, and most of the organizations that are members of that have something to do with water, either a water provider or water contractor or something of that nature. Then the next one is the Department of Homeland Security Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis. They provide information on a periodic basis as things are identified out there, and these include attacks on other water systems, whether they be internationally located worldwide or in the United States. The Homeland Security Information Network, HISN, is dedicated to the protection of critical infrastructure. And this is a really good organization we'll talk about now. InfraGard Houston, I'm one of the original members and have been for many years. This is an organization that's private, made up of the companies and the governments that are in charge of critical infrastructure. It's sponsored by FBI Houston. They have, that district office provides 2 FBI agents whose sole job is to work with the 2,000 or 3,000 member InfraGard Houston chapter in order to disseminate information about threats or to collect information for dissemination to other members in the organization. And then there's the Emergency Management and Response, ISAC, Information Sharing Organization. And it has good information for organizations who have an emergency response unit, and we consider our security response as emergency response. And the Environmental Protection Agency Security Division, as John Paul stated before, has a lot of resources available. And then the Department of Homeland's daily open source infrastructure report is all of the attacks and things that happen to critical infrastructure on a daily basis. This is a non-classified, non-security protected source that's delivered to me every day, and it's broken down into the 16 different types of infrastructure, and it's based upon open source information, usually out of newspapers and magazines and so forth. So lastly, once we are armed with all this information and we have our systems in place, we need to plan, train, exercise to react appropriately. The military is a good place to understand this, because all of their plans and training and exercises are geared to making sure that all the participants know exactly what to do during exigent circumstances when thinking is sometimes not as good as it is during normal conditions, and they can act appropriately. And we have 3 conditions under the National security status. The first one is normal conditions, the next one is elevated alert, and the last one is imminent alert. And we have our normal conditions, our normal protection assets in place, and elevated, we start to do such things as increase the frequency and extent of monitoring water quality, increasing surveillance. We even have the ability to hire off-duty law enforcement officers, which in a real emergency, you need to understand that there's no security officer sitting on the bench like in a football game, for example, where the coach can, if one of the A players goes out, they can run over and tap one of the B players on the back and put them in. It takes months for a security company to get a security guard. They got to go through training, they got to be licensed, they have to be put into the position, and to see if they can do the job, and they have to be properly supervised. So that's where an off-duty law enforcement officer really brings benefit to us, and we use them during high threat and emergency situations. We have people that we can pick up the phone and call them, and if they're not working for the law enforcement agency, they come right away. And with that, I believe that is okay. The last thing we have is what works with regard to hiring our in-house, our contract security officers. Well, in the past, we've treated it like any other contract where we just went out for bids and we had a list of expectations, and that didn't work out too well. So now we have progressed to where we are going out and requesting qualifications from the different security providers. We're partnering with the City of Houston, who's running a parallel way of doing this. And we are going to arm security officers. City already has that. And we're establishing a minimum hourly wage for all security positions, so that instead of the amount of pay the security guards are going to get, we are going to set what that's going to be, and then all of the bidding companies will adhere to our expectations. And then we also want those folks to have some benefits like uniforms. Some of the companies out there, they have to buy their own uniforms, and you know what you get when that happens. Training expectations, a little bit of vacation, sick leave, and a lot of awards. A lot of the contract security companies hardly ever award their security personnel, which helps with morale and helps them want to do a better job. And so these are the things that we are about to embark on. And so basically that's how we apply security, where our rubber meets the road, so to speak, and how we maintain good security in this facility. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Mike. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, you can submit those through the chat session, and we'll try to get those presented to the different speakers as we begin our panel discussion. You can transfer that back over to Julie, Mike.
Okay.
As we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, we have received approval from TCEQ to get your continuing education credits. Julie, can you flip over to the screen with the questions on it so we can go over those? So we do have two questions that in order to achieve your CEU credits, you'll need to respond to. The first one is, what type of fence is required to be installed around treatment facilities? And the answer is intruder resistant fence. The other question has multiple options for the answers. You just need to answer two of the five. One of two of the five events is listed in TCEQ Chapter 290 that must be reported to the Executive Director if the event may negatively impact safe and adequate drinking water. An unusual or unexplained unauthorized entry at property of the public water system, an act of terrorism against the public water system, an unauthorized attempt to probe for or gain access to proprietary information that supports the key activities of the public water system, a theft of property that supports the key activities of the public water system, or a natural disaster accident or act that results in damage to the public water system. And this leads to a question that was raised by one of our audience members. John Paul, I'm going to ask this question of you. Attacks can occur in many different ways. There's malicious user eavesdrops, intercepts, man-in-the-middle type attacks, stolen passwords. What constitutes a terroristic attack that needs to be reported to executive management for this requirement?
Sure. We know a terrorism or terroristic attack pretty much comes in two flavors, both foreign and domestic. But at the heart of it, it's any attack that is causes harm to civilians. So your law enforcement agencies are going to look at the scenario, look at the situation, and determine whether or not the purpose of the attack was to cause physical, bodily health harm to any civilian. That is going to be categorized as a terroristic attack. So an attack on a water treatment facility, damaging the chemical treatment area or any of the equipment thereof, that then prohibits that facility from properly treating the water, will be considered a terroristic attack. If the ultimate goal was to cause harm to a civilian, then that type of event, would be something that needs to be reported to TCEQ. There's a lot of room for interpretation on that. Kind of like the old saying goes, when in doubt, just go ahead and do it. So if any kind of event occurs at one of the facilities that, could potentially put a civilian or the public at harm, those are the events that the TCEQ wants to be reported on. And it's not to really point the finger at that particular utility, but it's really just to draw awareness and make it statewide, because if it's happening at one facility, then that bad actor may be trying to go next door, a few miles down, north, south, wherever. And so we can fight it better at a state level if they're made aware of it, and that's kind of just the reason behind why that's an item there.
Okay, thanks, John Paul. And obviously, there's different types. What you're addressing is a wide variety that can be not only from a physical security but also from a cybersecurity perspective. So I guess, Mike, just ask you from a end user, from a utility perspective, what are some of the major challenges that you at Coastal Water Authority have to address? You talked about a lot of the different things that you're doing, but what do you consider maybe the top 3 challenges that you have to face, that you face on a daily basis, that you have to address to make sure that you've secured your facilities, not only from physical but also from a cyber perspective?
Yes, basically, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, basically, we are located at the intersection of the Houston Ship Channel and the San Jacinto River. So we have a lot of activity around us. So we monitor that activity, and we've partnered with the U.S. Coast Guard. We provided them with a small corner of our land where they've erected a tower, and on that tower are multiple cameras and sensing systems that the Coast Guard uses to determine if there is an issue on the ship channel. And then on the other end of our facility, next to Interstate 10, we have provided a small area of land for the Houston, Harris County's infrastructure protection. And basically what that is was a $34 million grant provided by the Department of Homeland Security and the Houston group, which is made up of both governments and private companies like refineries, for example, have set up a chain around the Houston Ship Channel so as to detect things well out there and be able to react to them. So that's what we did here by enabling responders, first responders to a security incident, to be able to see what the incident is on our property, in addition to us knowing what it is on our property using the camera systems and the radar. And so the next thing is having individuals being able to respond, law enforcement response, because we are spread out along 3 counties. And so having good working relationships with those law enforcement agencies is very important, and maintaining good lines of communication. And then, of course, one of the real priorities is making sure that our employees are those eyes and ears out there. As they travel around, they see things that are suspicious, and the first thing they do is call me and say, hey, this just doesn't look right. Maybe we need to check it out. And with those 3 things, we're able to stay on top of things with regard to determine if there's a problem.
Okay. Mike, can you elaborate a little bit? You mentioned about the grant program that you received. One of the questions that we received in was, are there any grant programs to assist with implementing these types of security programs? Can you elaborate a little bit on the grant that you received and how you were able to procure that?
Well, we've applied for grants. Specifically, the money comes from, I believe, Department of Homeland Security, and it goes to the state governor's office. There is a person who works for the governor that administers grants and for security purposes, and doles it out to the applicants according to a fair share, so to speak. Actually, we have put in for a couple of grants, but we did not actually receive them. But we are constantly looking for opportunities to request a grant, and we partnered on the last grant that we had because the criteria was that they wanted multiple agency applications. We partnered with the City of Houston Public Works Department, and that grant was signed by both our executive director and the mayor of the City of Houston, and it went in for a request for funding.
Okay. All right. Change topics a little bit here. Sean, just out of curiosity, I had a discussion with a client recently, and we were talking a little bit about how to best protect the laptops that technicians that are supporting a lot of these unmanned facilities are going out and uploading or downloading programs. They've got all the HMI and PLC programs on there. But what's the best way to protect those laptops so that we make sure that the most recent updates and patches are on there from a security perspective, when you consider that those laptops may not always be connected to the enterprise level network?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, for me, with this type of a system, step one is always, I think you have to keep an inventory of all your devices. So you need to make sure you know what those devices are, how many of them you have, and who has those. So that's the first step, is making sure that you know how many of these tech laptops are out there floating around and who physically has got those in their hands. And then the next step is to keep an inventory of what's on that laptop. So software versions, what updates have been run and that type of thing. And there's some free software tools that are pretty good at being able to run through the registry files and automatically produce that type of a document for you of what's on there. So that then you can, as an administrator for those laptops, you can initiate that, because I don't know, a lot of times I think these laptops just get thrown in a bag, thrown in a truck somewhere, and they don't get opened until something goes wrong. That could be a really long period of time. So I think really you need to be able to initiate when it's time to make those updates, and that you've vetted those updates to make sure that, Wonderware doesn't have an issue with it, or it doesn't crash your iFix system or whatever, that those have all been approved by the manufacturers, that the updates are all good with the software versions that you have. But I think the biggest thing is just making sure that that you keep track of those devices, you know where you are, you know what's on them, and that you initiate those updates on those devices.
Could I add one thing?
And I guess, sure. Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, the former employer that I had this software on the laptop, since they're the most pilfered form of computers, and it was running in the background so that you really couldn't see it even if you looked on the directory. And basically what that thing did was it made a call every day to the main computer and said, this is computer 1234, for example, and I'm still connected and everything's good. And then when it gets stolen, then it misses its call, and the main computer notifies the administrator that computer 1234 did not call in, and so you can know that that's missing, because a lot of times these computers come up missing and you don't know it for a couple of days. And then when it gets to be plugged in by whoever stole it or whoever bought it from the person who stole it, the first telephone call it makes is back to the mother computer and says, oh, my new location is this code. And basically what happens is you find out what the location and the name of the company is that has that particular code, and then you call the police and they get a warrant and go out and recover the computer, because people don't take laptops apart because they're just too difficult to do, as opposed to a larger computer. So that's one thing that the company I used to work for uses.
That's interesting. So it sounds like it's a combination of technical solutions, but also policies for the employees to help protect that as well. I guess another question that's come in from Coastal Water Authority's perspective, Mike, what are you guys doing from the standpoint of backing up the data at the offsite systems, whether you have PLCs or operator interface terminals? What's your methodology for making sure that you have the most recent backups?
Well, basically, we have about a year ago, we hired a manager of IT systems, and he has a process where he is backing up, I believe on a daily basis, the different servers and so forth, and storing it at an off-site location, so that if something does happen, it can be reinstated back into its original form pretty quickly.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm going to pose this question to Sean and John Paul, so whichever one of you wants to jump in first. But what are you seeing in the industry with regards to communication infrastructure to help protect from a cybersecurity perspective on remote facilities? Are we looking at redundant communication channels, failover schemes, different types of technology, maybe moving away from the serial-based communication to the IP-based Ethernet communication? John Paul, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, definitely. So redundant communication channels are definitely one of the, I guess you could say, key things in business continuity. So keeping these systems up and going. However, with the redundant communication channels, you now have two doors. You now have two ways to end up getting into the system. So as it relates to cybersecurity, it's really an organizational policies and procedures to stay on top of that and make sure that each one of those doors are locked, for lack of better words, and to make sure that only the people that have the proper authorization are allowed to get onto a network, access certain devices on the network, and do whatever they need to do across the network. One of the things, so when you talk about communications, a big deal is actually the network security or the network segmentation, which is configuration and setup of your network routers, your switches, your modems. You want to make sure that all of those have been properly set up and that you're not just running off of the default configuration for everything. Unfortunately, nowadays everything is programmable. Every device that has some type of electronics in it, 9 times out of 10, there's some type of programmable setting that you can configure and set up throughout. So making sure that you're not using default passwords for anything, changing from the default communications network IDs, this, that, and the other, will help further increase your cyber resiliency as it relates to communications. Sean, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I would say, you know, because we do a lot of work with mud districts, with smaller types of sites on these unmanned sites, and the thing that I always try to keep in mind for a lot of these is I don't want to be completely dependent on SCADA. So kind of my one of the methods that I use sometimes, in addition to the technical means that you talk about, John Paul, is can I turn it off and still run my plant? So in a worst case scenario, can I shut my network down and all of my sites can operate independently? If I have an issue with a PLC somewhere, can I shut it down and run in some sort of a relay backup mode, at least for a while, until I can figure out what my problem is and get the system back up? So, you know, in addition to the means of securing, if I just totally get into a pinch, can I just shut the thing down, still operate my plant, and kind of be able to wrap my mind around the problem solve, figure out what I need to fix, and fix it to bring the system back up?
Thanks, Sean. We're running up against the time limit here of when our program was going to end. So I'm going to ask each of you if you could just give some final thoughts or recommendations that you have for our audience members. Sean, if you'd like to go ahead and start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely say, you know, we've all three have kind of talked about the importance of the culture of security and keeping your site secure. And I guess what I would say is one of the things that I always love and respect about water and wastewater plant operators is that they have this mindset of, you know, if all else fails, I'm going to make it work with duct tape and bubble gum and whatever I got to stick together. But with SCADA, with cybersecurity, you really that's not something that you want to throw together. So don't go off on your own and just bring in a data line without getting some assistance on security. Don't do some of these kind of things. Don't give yourself workarounds for the security system, because as soon as there is a workaround, you might not be the only one that has it.
Mike, you want to go next?
Sure. Basically, what I would recommend is that you have the highest level of security, physical security, personnel security, and information security that you possibly can economically. In other words, you don't want a security system that's so expensive protecting something that's not so expensive, in other words. And then also, I used to have to testify as an expert witness for my former employer in federal district court on things that were security in nature. So when I look at something, I, in my mind, based on that past experience, think, how am I going to explain this to the 12 people sitting in the jury box? What did we do, or what could have we done better to protect against losing the flow of water, for example? And did we take every precaution necessary? And could the folks that are in the jury box or the folks that are behind the bench understand why we did something or why we didn't do something to protect our system and that precious water that's flowing through it?
Okay. John Paul?
Yeah, and I guess I'll close it out here. You know, I'm just going to say education. Educating all of the individuals within your organization on the importance of security. That is going to be the primary element of making sure that your organization has a security culture. As it relates to securing unmanned facilities, you know, executives, board members, people that are making the decision, they need to be educated on the importance of the security. They need to be educated on the what ifs. You know, what if we do not put in this type of access control system at this facility? This is what could happen. And so as long as everybody within the organization is routinely being educated on security, you know, once or twice a year, whatever the frequency may be needed, that is going to help increase the security throughout the organization and at unmanned facilities.
Thanks. Thank you to John Paul, and obviously thank you to Sean and Mike as well. I know putting these teams together sometimes take a lot more time than you realize, and a lot of times it's after hours. I appreciate you guys pulling this program together to support the efforts of the Safety and Security Committee. And also, I'd like to thank all the audience members for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar. We do plan on providing some additional webinars in the coming year. The Safety and Security Committee is in the works of planning some, but we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus for the holidays and start back up again after the new year. In addition, we are planning on having another symposium like we did a couple of years ago in 2016 that's focused on operational preparedness. The tentative dates on that are not completely set, but it's going to be probably going to be in the early part of August of 2018. We're continuing to plan our activities as a committee, and we have several members of the committee that have been gracious enough to volunteer their time to help support that. But we're always looking for ideas, and the purpose of this committee is for you, the audience members, and we want to try to address topics that are of interest to you. So if you do have some suggestions on some things that we can either talk about in these webinars, or for the seminar that we're planning for August, feel free to route those questions to Nyla Langford at nblangford@sig-auto.com, and she's one of the members of our committee and will help corral us in talking about those things as we plan for the future. The webinar, the presentations for this webinar will be available on the WEAT website. They should be up there within the next week. So if you'd like to see those and the recording of the audio as well, if you'd like to see that, you'll have access to it on the WEAT website. Again, I thank you all for joining us, and I certainly thank all the speakers for the time they put into this and for their great presentations. We look forward to seeing you again in 2018. Goodbye.